Hey there, it's Ben Hassel here, and here in this tutorial we're going to have a look at how we set up a new project in Final Cut Pro 10. We're going to look at the default location that Final Cut Pro likes to save your files, and then also talk about some different ways, perhaps some better ways in which you can do that file storage. We'll also talk about what happens to your video when you capture it into Final Cut Pro 10, so that you can kind of make some decisions about the best way to manage your files. What will happen when you're working with video after you've created your projects and you're working on different projects and libraries is your hard drive will start to fill up, especially if you're working on a laptop or an older laptop. You'll find that you end up running out of storage space quite quickly after a few edits. So in this tutorial we're going to run through some tips for file management, for setting up a new library or project, and then how to manage those files once you're set up in Final Cut Pro 10. Now, if you're interested in these types of videos of tips and tricks for Final Cut Pro 10 and also answers to questions that you or others have posted on the YouTube channel, then please do hit the subscribe button and the notifications button to get updated whenever I post a new YouTube video. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in future videos, and look forward to getting your comments. So without further ado, let's dive in and have a look at how we create a new project in Final Cut Pro 10. So here in Final Cut Pro, we're going to first of all reset the screen layout so that I know we're all looking at the same layout for our screen. So if we go to Window and Workspaces, you can see there's a few different options here for the default workspace and for organizing things, and also for color and effects that we can see here. We're going to select the default workspace. That just means that when we're looking at the screen here, we're all looking at the same interface. You can also show and hide different elements of your Final Cut Pro interface up at the top right here. So if we click on these items, we're showing and hiding the different libraries we have open. We can also show and hide the inspector, and these are important to have open when we're setting up a new library, and particularly here so that we can highlight a couple of things about that new library. So if we come up to the top left here, we can close down the two libraries that I have open here. So if I right click on one of my libraries, I can go to Close Library, and that will allow me to close that library, or we can select the library and go to File, Close Library, and close those libraries down. So when we have nothing open, our timeline will appear empty and we'll have nothing up in the library or the library browser up at the top left. So we're going to go ahead and set up a new library. Now when you're setting up a brand new library, there's really two places that you should set it up. One is on an external hard drive, and that's what I would normally do. The other is in your movies folder. And the reason for putting it in your movies folder on your computer is because if you save it on the desktop and you're using iCloud to sync up your projects, then Final Cut Pro doesn't want to work from the network, and actually you'll get a warning if you try and set up a new project on the desktop. So we're going to click on Library here, and the first thing we're going to be able to go in and do is select the Movies folder, which we can see on the left hand side here. And when we're working in the Movies folder, it's set up so that when we're editing in Final Cut Pro, it's always working on the local version of that project. Now, I'm normally editing on one of these external hard drives that I have set up here, and those are set up with solid state drives. It makes your projects nice and portable, and at the moment you can get some really good deals on external solid state drives. So if you're looking for an external solid state drive that is portable, that will also work with USB and USB-C, then these Samsung T5 portable solid state drives are a good place to start. And you can see the price obviously increases as you buy more space, but I would go for normally a 1 terabyte or a 2 terabyte drive. And then in order to keep that backed up, you can add it to your time machine to keep your external solid state drive backed up. So that's something else to have a look at. But this is a good external solid state drive to use, and you can see here it has the two different USB style cables, so you can plug it into a newer Mac and an older Mac at the same time, so it's nice and flexible in that way. We're going to jump back into Final Cut Pro here, and for this project we're going to set something up in our movies folder, and we will call this Mexico Edit. And basically the library we're creating here is going to store all of our imported footage, all of our edits, any audio that we import, and we'll have a look at how that works once we've actually set our library up. So if we hit save here, we can see a couple of things. So importantly, up at the top left we can see our library, we can see our events, and our events are a really good way of organizing our footage into different categories or into different dates in Final Cut Pro 10. and we'll have a look at the import process into our events folder in a minute. Now if we come across to the right, we'll see some information about the library. We can see, importantly, the size of the library. So actually, when we're working on our Final Cut Pro projects, if at any time we want to see how big our library is, we can basically select the library item up at the top left here, and we'll be able to see how much space that library is taking up on our hard drive. So let's go ahead and import some footage. So I'm going to go to File and Import and Media. So you'll see there's always a couple of different options for importing files. One is the cameras up at the top, any devices such as external hard drives, and I've got a couple of favorites locations where I'm organizing stuff here. So if we go to the desktop, I have some footage that I'm going to import from, and I'm going to drop this down. And in here, I'm going to go into the Mexico project folder. So we can jump into one of these folders here and see the different bits of footage that we have. We can scroll through, we can select a piece of footage and use the bar at the top to scrub through that footage to see if it's any good. So we've got some different shots of waves, some shots of people surfing, and a variety of other things, and some kind of wide shots of the beach and that kind of thing, which we can use here. So to import clips, there's a couple of different ways of doing that. One is to select an individual clip, and we can then select that, and I'm going to use the option here, copy to library. So it's actually going to make a copy of that footage to my library, which is useful when you're first starting out at Final Cut Pro, because it means you know you've got all your footage in that library as you set it up. And we can leave the files in place. And that's how I normally edit. So basically I do my media management, my footage management before I start working in Final Cut Pro, and I have folders organized, and then I will import that into Final Cut Pro. But because I don't want to make a duplicate of those original files, I'll leave those files in place. But it does mean that if you move the Final Cut Pro project, then you need to move those external folders as well. So as you're starting out, copying the items to the library is the best option. And then we can also create keywords from folders, and we can do some other options down here, such as transcoding to proxy media, which is a good option if you're working on a laptop or an older or slower computer, or in 4K, and you want to actually change that footage to a format that's a little bit easier to play forwards and backwards when you're working in Final Cut Pro. A lot of the compressed camera footage that we work with is really good at playing forwards because of the way it's compressed, but if you try and play it backwards, it can get a little bit jumpy, and that's where proxy footage or optimized media comes in. It does use up a bit more space on your hard drive, but it can be a good idea. And then we have some options for analyzing and fixing our footage, which I tend to just do manually once I've imported that footage. So we're going to close the window after we've started importing, and we'll click Import Selected, and we'll see now that piece of footage has imported into this event that we have here. And if we click on the footage, just like we could with the library, we can see some information about that video across on the right. Importantly, the resolution and frame rate underneath the information. So this footage is 960 by 540. And it's also running at 59.94 frames per second, which means that when we set up a timeline for our project, we want to create that timeline at 29.97 or 59.94 frames per second, depending on what our output is going to be. And the 59.94 or 60 frames per second footage is nice because it means you can slow it down to half speed, but still get that kind of nice, smooth motion. So if we go back to File and Import, and then Media, we can see here that we can, rather than selecting individual files, we can select a whole folder. So if I select one of these folders, it's going to import into this existing event, and I'll hit Import Selected. Now it's copied all that footage across to my library. You can see everything is listed there, and now we can begin to kind of manage that footage and work with it. What we can also see is that the keyword for that folder has been used. So basically, when I've imported that folder of footage, it's actually applied a keyword because of my settings in the import window, so I can view just the footage on that card on its own. So now when you hover over your footage, depending on whether you've got scrubbing turned on or off, you'll see a kind of preview of that footage. I have scrubbing turned off here at the moment, and you can see now if I hover over, if I turn it on over here and then hover over the footage, I'm going to get a small preview of that footage. So now that we've set up our library and we've imported some footage, we're going to go ahead and look at what happens when we make a new project. And what we're interested in here is really what happens when we set up our timeline and begin to render footage, and how that affects our library file in terms of size and disk space that's being taken up when we start to add effects and that kind of thing. And we'll also talk a little bit about the timeline setup, thinking about what output settings you want when you're actually outputting your video. So we're going to go ahead now to File and New Project, but you can also click on the New Project button down here on the timeline if you haven't created any timeline projects yet. So we'll go to File, New and Project, and this is where you'll normally come to set up your timeline. And in here we've got a couple of different options. We've got some options for using automatic settings, which are great, but you need to be careful when you're using those, especially if you're working with something like 4K footage and you don't want to set up a 4K timeline, you want to set up a 1080p timeline. You won't necessarily want to use those automatic settings to set things up. You'll want to actually come in here and set things up manually. And we'll just have a little look at what can happen when we use those automatic settings. So we'll use this as a test timeline. Okay. And of the footage we imported some footage at 1080p. So if we select some of these clips, then we can see many of these clips are shot at 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames per second, or 59.94. But one of the original clips that we imported was actually a lower resolution, so it's actually 960 by 540, the same frame rate. Now what will happen here if we drag this down to the timeline is a couple of things. One is that this is not a standard piece of footage, so Final Cut Pro is a little bit confused. The automatic settings are going to set up this lower resolution 720p timeline when actually most of the footage we're editing with is 1080p. So it's just something to be mindful of if you're using things like archive footage or higher resolution 4K footage when you're editing, just to be mindful of the output settings that you want. So if we click OK to this and we'll scroll up in our library here, we can see that our new timeline is set up at 960 by 720, so 720p, and if we drop our HD footage onto there, it's actually going to be scaled down. So that's why we're getting this little render bar there, because our HD footage doesn't match the scale of the timeline. So we don't really want to work with this particular timeline, so we're going to select here and right click and move this project to the trash. And we'll go ahead and create a new project. So normally when I'm setting up an edit, and this will be the same for a lot of people, you want to create a new project, and if you're uploading to YouTube or a lot of other platforms, then setting up something that's a 1080p, 1920 by 1080, and either 29.97 or 30 frames per second will be good for most edits that you're doing. So obviously that depends on what camera you're working on. If you're working in the UK or other countries that use PAL, then you may be shooting at 25 frames per second or 50 frames per second. So just check out your camera settings, have a look on the back, run through the settings on your iPhone or on your camera and see what frame rate it's shooting at. So really with 59.94, when I'm editing at 29.97, the frame rate of that footage is just going to enable me to slow it down to half speed and keep a smooth motion in the video. So that's really the reason I'm shooting at 60 frames per second for this edit. I'm going to leave the audio settings at 48 kilohertz, and then we'll just click OK. And we've set up an untitled project here, which is not always a good idea. So I'm going to click here once, and we can then rename our project. And I'm going to call this Mexico Surf Edit. We'll just have a look at what happens now when we drop a few clips down to the timeline. We're not really going to edit on the timeline here. We're just going to throw a few clips down and find a few different videos here. And really what I want to do here is just throw a few videos down to the timeline, and we're going to add an effect on here, a speed change, and we'll just use that to show how Final Cut Pro renders out and increases the disk space that's being used for a particular project. So if we select all these clips now, and we come to the retiming options here, we can slow this down to 50%. And what we'll see straight away is that these clips now are unrendered. So basically Final Cut Pro hasn't rendered out these clips. So if I just move away, we'll see Final Cut Pro will start background rendering our clips, and we can see that up here in this little background task button at the top. We can see the rendering, any outputting that Final Cut Pro is doing. And what this rendering is doing is creating a separate new file that is rendering that speed change into the file. And this will happen if we do any color changes or we add any transitions. So the main thing we're interested in here is the library setup and the kind of project setup in Final Cut Pro. And if we select our library now, we can see that across here on the right hand side, it shows us the library size, which is 12.5 gigabytes. And actually a lot of that space will be the footage we've imported and also the render files that we've created. And we can actually go and have a look at that. So if we come to our library here, and we'll have a look at this, and then we'll look at how we can kind of manage that file size and the render files as we're working on a project. We'll right click here and we're going to go to Reveal in Finder. That's going to show us our library on the hard drive, so in our movies folder where we set it up. So now we can see, if we stretch this out a little bit, the size of our library. And if we right click on this, the library is really just a container for any video, audio, images and all the edits that you've made to be contained within. So it looks like a folder, but actually we can go inside it by showing the package contents for this, and we can see inside there the one event that we have, so this 24th of April 2019, and we have our edits, our original media and our render files. And so if we click on our render files here and go to File, Get Info, so on the Finder here, we can see that our render files are 3.28 gigabytes. And that's just from a quick speed change on a minute or two of video footage. So we haven't added any real effects there. We've just kind of added a small speed change to that video over a reasonable amount of time, but it's created this 3.28 gigabytes worth of files. So you can see how quite quickly you can create more and more render files in an edit just by doing some simple effects. If we go to our original media, this is all the original footage that's been imported, and we'll just stretch this out a teeny tiny bit more in our event here, and we can see that our original media is taking up 9 gigabytes. So that's where the 12 gigabytes is mainly coming from. It's basically the original media and then also the render files that have been created. So if we close this now, and we'll just close this window too, we'll come back into Final Cut Pro. So if we want to delete those render files or clean up those render files, then we can go to File, Delete Generated Library Files, and what this will do is it will delete or allow us to delete any unused render files or all of our render files, and also any optimized media or proxy media. So this is a good way of cleaning up your Final Cut Pro library, but you're only deleting stuff that Final Cut Pro can remake. So it's safe to delete your render files, either the unused ones or even all of them, as long as you've got the time to re-render them. So if I click all here and click OK, and then we'll click away from the library and then click back to the library, and we can see that the library now has dropped back down to 9.3 gigabytes. It's re-rendering now, so we're going to get those 3.28 gigabytes back pretty quickly. So if you are archiving a project, what you would want to do is actually delete those render files and then close your library straight afterwards, so that you don't re-render those files. Otherwise we will end up increasing that file size, and we can see as the render's happening, the size is going up back up to 12 gigabytes. So as you're thinking about the size of your projects and where you're going to store them, think about the render files, any effects that you're going to add, and also the size of the hard drive inside your Mac. So some MacBook Pros or MacBooks will only have 250 gigabyte hard drives, and you can quite quickly fill a lot of that space up with your system, your software, and then a few video edits. So even if you've got 5 to 10 edits, you may find that your hard drive fills up quite quickly. So it's not just to increase speed that you would want to edit from an external hard drive, it's also to keep your system hard drive free, because as soon as that system hard drive fills up completely, then it becomes very hard for your computer to actually do any task. So you want to try and keep normally 25 to 50% of your hard drive, your system hard drive that your software and your Mac OS X system is running from, completely clear, so that things can run quickly. And then editing from an external hard drive is going to be really good, and an external solid state drive will make things run much more smoothly. So one last thing that we'll have a peek at here, if we want to import other elements into our project here, then we may want to organize our events here. So if we go to File, New, and Event, then we can create new events in here. So I'm going to create an event called Audio, and it's going to drop into our Mexico edit library. We can have it create a new project if we want to, but it's just the audio that we're going to import, so we don't need to do that. And I'm going to click OK. And now if I go to File and Import and Media, I'm going to pop onto my desktop here, and I've got some audio in one of these folders here. So we'll just come to this audio folder. We're going to select, holding down Shift, a few of these different tracks, and you can see now that when we're adding them to an event, it's selected the event that we have selected already in Final Cut Pro. So it's going to add it to our audio event, although we could select our previous event if we want to. So it's going to add it to an existing event. It's going to copy those files to the library, these audio files, so they'll be stored in that library where we were looking at before in that bundle, and we will click Import Selected. And now you can see those events help to keep things nice and organized. So we might have on here our Mexico surf footage folder, and then our audio folder, and that just helps us to kind of keep things organized. And normally I will have folders if I have different shots from different days, and also for different cameras I'll organize things within those events in Final Cut Pro. And there's a couple of different ways in which you can organize things, but the events is a good place to start. And then you can move into adding keywords for different parts of the footage. So you might go through your footage and add different keywords. So we've got surfer and dog here, so we might add a keyword for that particular piece of footage, and that will also help us to organize the videos too, but that's something for another tutorial. So I hope that's been useful, having a look at how Final Cut Pro manages your library projects, where things are stored, also how you can clean things up in the library. Going back to where things are stored on the desktop, you can, if you do want to, even when Final Cut Pro is not open, go into these folders and delete the render file. So if your hard drive becomes so full that you can't actually even open Final Cut Pro because things are running so slowly, then you can dig around inside that library and delete things like the render files. But be careful, run some tests on that before you do that, because if you delete things like the original media, then you could run into trouble later. So that's an overview of how to set up a library in Final Cut Pro, how to set up your edit. You can also have multiple edits in Final Cut Pro. So we've only set up one project timeline here, but we can go ahead and set up multiple project timelines within the same library. What I would encourage you to do though is, if you do start something brand new, so from a different trip or a different interview or a completely different project, then do go out and set up a new library. You generally want your libraries to be project-based, so you don't want to have multiple projects within one library. So create a library for each of the projects that you're working on, and have different edits within those libraries that relate to that one project, and that will help you to manage your workflow in Final Cut Pro. So I hope that's been a useful intro to working with libraries in Final Cut Pro and setting things up. If you have any questions, then please do leave a comment below, and I look forward to seeing you on the next tutorial.